good to go.
Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order and welcome you to the the special meeting of the Milwaukee Planning Commission. Agendas and additional copies of staff reports are available at the city website at www.milwaukeeoregon.gov. You may locate them by navigating to the community calendar where tonight's meeting page is posted. If you have not reviewed the agenda, please do so. It contains important information about the process. Are there any informational items from staff?
Not at this time.
Audience participation. This is an opportunity to comment on items not on tonight's agenda. Does anyone in attendance wish to comment on an item that is not on tonight's agenda? If so, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom or press *9 if you're connected over the phone to indicate that you wish to make a comment. We will also check with any audience members who have called in. Oh, wait, I just told you how to do that by phone. Before you testify, please remember to state your name and spell it for the record.
Vice Chair Edge, there is one person in our attendees section. Her name is, or their name is Marilyn Fay, but I don't see that they've put their hand up. So,
okay.
Checking to see.
This would be the opportunity to do so. And we'll move on to work session items. The work session tonight is to discuss the first batch of draft code and map amendments developed to begin implementing sections of the comprehensive plan. Senior Planner Vera Colias will present the information for discussion.
Hey. Good evening, all. Thanks very much. Welcome to batch number 1. I do have a presentation to go over this first batch. I did kind of just wanted to lay out for everyone sort of as I put in the staff report, because there's a lot of amendments and there's a lot of stuff to go over. We have broken things up into batches. So this is the first batch of discussion items. If there are other things that folks want to talk about, of course we can, but I kind of tried to put everything into manageable chunks of information or for topics. So I'm going to share my screen. Go. Okay. All right. Is everyone seeing the PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. Just want to circle back again on the policy mandates for this project that are provided to us from the comprehensive plan to increase supply of middle housing and provide housing choice throughout the city, to increase tree canopy and preserve existing trees, and to manage parking to enable both middle housing and protect trees in our residential zones. Again, this is our code review schedule as proposed for tonight, and then the next 2 work sessions. Tonight, we'll be talking about the comprehensive plan and the land use map, the zoning map, permitted uses within the zones, definitions, parking, and ADU review and design and development standards. And then you can see here, and it was in the staff report, I just sort of keep putting in there what we're talking about on next Tuesday: flag lots and back lots, natural resources code, and Title 17 land division. And then we'll complete the series on August 24th with talking about the tree code. Peter Passarelli will be at the meeting to go over the tree code, and we'll talk about design and development standards for middle housing. There's a lot there, so that's why that's the one topic that we'll be talking about on the 24th. And we can certainly go back to things and review things. If things come up tonight, we can pull them forward for Tuesday, and we can kind of keep doing this. Is intended to be an iterative process to the extent we can, but keeping things moving forward as well. Okay. The first section, just wanted to touch on, we had a limited list of definitions that we are proposing to amend within the code. A couple of new definitions, and the bulk of them have to do with the middle housing types themselves. They're obviously not in our code right now. We will be adding or proposing to add another definition, but we'll be talking about that on Tuesday, which is the backlots. So I don't have that in this list of code sections, or list of definitions, but these are the items or the terms that we are either proposing to be new or amend within the definition section. Are there any questions or comments about the terms that we've put forward or the language that we're using for the definitions? And these are, moving targets. We've sort of already started looking at a multi-unit development to replace our multifamily development definition that we think might be a little bit clearer. So by the time this comes to the hearing, it might be tweaked a little bit. But are there any questions or comments about the definitions that we've proposed? Anything?
Vera, this is Robert Massey.
Yeah.
You know, I think I understand that the term outright allowed. I think we've always had something like that, but have we always used that term? It kind of struck me as something I was not familiar with.
Well, so there are a couple of different ways to say that. Outright allowed, allowed by right. There are a couple of different things. The consultant suggested that we actually define the term. It's not listed in our code anywhere as anything, but to clarify that some things you just can go to a building permit. There isn't a land use. And so the idea was to make it really clear what is an outright allowed use and what does that mean? Is outright allowed, does allowed by right sound better? What does it, that's what we meant certainly by the outright allowed, but it's never been included in our code. We thought it was a good idea to clarify that.
Yeah, I understood it as just a familiar, it's just a term that's pretty bold. I'm not against it or anything like that. I just was not familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay.
Certainly, if the term is open for discussion, I would suggest using by right.
Allowed by right or just by right?
Yeah.
Allowed by right? Okay. All right, let's do that. Okay. Got it. All right. We will make that change.
May I ask about the tree one? I know this is silly, but how come it doesn't say planted in the ground? Couldn't you literally, by this definition, just put a potted plant somewhere?
So this definition of tree is the same as the definition in the tree code. It's intended to be the same. It's a good question. So I can, we can double back. I'll double back with Peter Passarelli.
And I guess the old definition never had it either.
Right. Didn't.
But I think it might help define or diffuse a problem if somebody wanted to go put a potted plant that had the ability to grow to 16 feet to kind of block development if they wanted to, I guess.
Got it. No, that makes sense. All right. I will talk to Peter and yeah, and we can see about making sure that clarification is made. Good point.
It's a little off and from a definitions perspective, but maybe it's more stylistic. And I noticed there was multiple moves where the old verbiage was shall, and it's now kind of being converted to must. But I wanted to just flag, there's several instances that the consultant might want to do a word search because not all of them were caught. I saw a handful as I was kind of going
Yeah,
through. So
that makes
wanted
sense.
to flag that. And then, I know that in Denny's departure, Laura's, the position Laura now occupies was reframed as the planning manager. There's still a lot of verbiage in there around the planning director, and I don't know if that creates any challenges, but just wanted to flag that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I have a list of find and replace things, and so I'm going to make sure I've got a bunch of them. So as we go through, we'll do one big sweep of all of these things. So thank you for noticing that. We were catching them as we go, and then we haven't done one full final find and replace for the manager director piece, and the shall and must is going to be a never-ending goal, I think, to try to get to that. But thank you for pointing that out. I think just so you know, I think there are a couple of spots where single family hasn't been replaced every time for single unit. And so there are a couple of different terms that we're going to need to work through a couple times to do a QA QC on those things. Thank you for calling those out, Commissioner Sherman.
On that subject as well, I think with respect to planning director versus planning manager, we may not want to change the city code around that. We might just include a definition for a planning director that could include a planning director or planning manager, or
Mm.
you know, but provide that in the definition, because I feel like there's a lot of state level language that refers to planning directors and planning director decisions and things like that. And so rather than be inconsistent with state language, maybe we would be consistent with that and then just include in our definition who can, whatever we want to describe the planning director as,
Mhm.
which could be a planning manager instead.
Oh, that's good. Maybe I'll verify with the city attorney just to what's the best way to do it, and we'll do that. But that's a really good point, that maybe we can just grab it in a definition instead. Okay. We may just want to do it anyway, because if titles change again, we have to do this again. So, but that's a good suggestion. Okay. Anything else? We can come back. That's fine. But maybe we'll keep going here. On to ADUs. So a couple of the key things that we've proposed in the ADU section of the code 19.910 is that currently ADUs are permitted as either, they are required to go through a land use review process, either a type 1 or a type 2, depending on the size of the ADU. So we are proposing to allow them by right, and then subject to design and development standards that are keyed to how large the ADU is. So they would be allowed by right, just like a single unit home is, or a duplex will be, or any of the other middle housing types. We're also proposing to include a revision. I'm going to jump to the type 2 piece for a second. So we'd be creating a type A ADU and a type B ADU. And so the type B ADU is the larger one, and with the corresponding setbacks and height and so on. And then we thought what we wanted to do was propose a new type of type 2 variance that would provide for an increase in size by 25% for a type B ADU. Right now, anything that exceeds that type 2 ADU automatically is a type 3 review process. And we thought that it seemed to make sense to allow for that small increase in size via type 2 process. If you wanted to go even larger than that, yeah, now we are in a type 3 process, but it seemed reasonable to provide for a small variation through the type 2 process. Notice, everyone gets notice, and there's an NDA, NDA receives notice as well in case folks have. So there's an opportunity for comment, but we wanted to provide a little bit of, not to take things away from the Planning Commission, but it seemed reasonable to allow for a type 2 variance in there. And
Kara, for our
yeah.
listening audience, can you
Mhm.
explain what a type B ADU is and then what the other types are?
Oh, sure. I'm so sorry. Yes, thank you. So right now, what we are proposing is to have a type A ADU is up to 600 square feet and 15 feet high. And the type B ADU would be up to 800 square feet or 2 stories tall. And in either case, the ADU is not to exceed 75% of the size of the main structure on the property. So it's intended to be smaller, and that's what our existing code is now. And that's pretty consistent with what an ADU is intended to be, accessory to the primary home on the property. So they are supposed to be smaller. But the type B is the ADU that's up to 800 square feet or up to 2 stories in height. And the type 2 variance would allow for a 25% increase in the square footage of the ADU through a type 2 process.
So if a
Vera,
type,
have we done an audit of like recent applications to see how many we would have diverted away from the Planning Commission and into this new type 2 variance category?
It actually would only be a couple. Most folks are actually building ADUs that are within the type 1 or the type 2. No offense, but folks don't want to go through the Planning Commission process if they don't have to. So we did have an ADU come through several years ago that was over 1,000 square feet, and it was approved. So that was well over that 25%. increase in size. And then there was one other ADU that had to come through you folks, but it actually was captured in the second bullet point, which has to, so the type 2 variance for ADUs generally would have to do with folks that are building a new ADU and want one that's bigger than the 800 square feet. The second bullet point, and I'll circle back to your question, Vice Chair Edge, in a second, but the second bullet point has to do with there's a what our code also includes is a square footage size for the structure itself that the ADU is in. So we have a sort of a floor area or square footage for the ADU itself, but we also have a maximum structure footprint. And where that really gets tricky is when someone is converting an existing accessory structure that exceeds the size, but they really only want the ADU to be, let's say 800 square feet, but the overall garage or whatever the structure is maybe is 1,000 square feet. And no matter how big the ADU itself is inside that big structure, they still would have to come through the Planning Commission for a variance. And I think the Planning Commission had a type 3 variance for just such a situation within the last couple of months, I believe. And I think it was like 50 square feet or something. It wasn't a lot of area. And the ADU itself was much smaller. I think it was 400 and something square feet. So this has come up particularly when we have older accessory structures that folks want to convert. So what the language does is allows for older accessory structures, so more than 3 years old, at the time of the adoption of this code, that you could convert that into to an ADU. You'd still need to meet the square footage for the ADU itself, but if the structure itself is bigger, you don't need to come through the Planning Commission for a type 3 variance. But the ADU itself can't be 1,000 square feet, but the ADU, it would still need to meet that 600 or the 800 square foot section. So we wanted to kind of divert those kinds of situations from a type 3 process. So I hope that answers your question. It's not that we haven't had that many, but when they come up, it's a big deal. It's a lot of process for folks to convert something when in fact the ADU itself is almost always smaller than the actual structure itself.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. Adam?
Thank you. I just wanted to, just for reference, so would it be similar to the type 3 review we had a few months ago? I don't know if this is the same one you're talking about, where the gentleman had to, because he had a sauna that was a little bit, that wasn't initially in that, when he did his initial ADU, he had to come back for the type 3 review to include that. It was already built though. Is that what this would be in relation to with the revisions to the footprint requirement?
I'm not familiar with that application that you're asking about. I know there was an application before you a couple of months ago where folks wanted to put an ADU inside a portion of their existing garage, and the garage itself was, I think, 850 square feet or something, but the ADU itself was 420. It was very small, actually. They were only using a portion of it, but they needed to come to you folks because of the size of the garage itself. Yeah.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarification. I just wanted to, thank you.
Yeah. And then as part of the ADU, oh, sorry, Commissioner Sherman, you have your hand up. Sorry.
Go ahead, Vera. I'll get you in a second.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just wanted to just conclude that a couple of the other edits that we've made to this section, we've removed for now yurts being an allowed detached ADU. Not that I'm a fan of yurts, I think they're great, but they don't meet the building code for residential structures. So it seems like we're leading people down a path that they can't get to because they actually don't meet the code. So that's why we've stricken that language. It's caused confusion, not a ton, but a couple of folks have had some, oh, I'll just do a yurt. Like, well, we'd like to be consistent with the building code if we can. And then I think those were the couple of big, but that concludes sort of the major key amendments to this section. And now happy to answer any questions. And I can stop sharing so we can stop looking at the screen.
Commissioner Sherman, go for it.
Thanks, Vice Chair Edge. Vera, thanks for the clarification on yurts. That was on my list of questions, and understanding that it doesn't work with the residential building code makes a lot of sense there. A few kind of things. I was still just kind of wanting to better understand kind of the rationale behind that 25% increase for the type B ADU. I recognize some individuals might want to build something slightly larger, and at some point, you know, we're talking about 1,000 square feet, which is a modest or small-ish house, as opposed to kind of what most folks typically think of as an accessory dwelling unit, which is kind of smaller. So can you just kind of help me kind of understand what some of the discussions are around that?
Mm-hmm. No, happy to. In some cases, you know, one could imagine, you're right, 800 square feet is a very reasonably sized structure. What we wanted to do was capture someone who might be looking at a structure that's slightly larger than that. 25% isn't a lot, you know, over the 800 square feet, but it provides people with a little bit of extra wiggle room for their design, for their structure, without having to go through the type 3 review process. There's still, like I said, NDA notification and neighbors and such, but we thought it was reasonable, as we already have a list of other kinds of type 2 variances for setbacks, lot coverage, fences. You know, we've got some other ones that we give people a little bit of extra if they go through a process, and we make sure that there aren't any impacts. And if folks, you know, did submit comments and said, you know what, a 2-story, you know, 850 square foot ADU in my backyard, that's a problem, and here's why. You know, there's a way for us to work through that process, but still give an applicant the ability to scooch that the area up a little bit. So is 25% the right number, or should we hold hard and fast to 800 square feet? We can certainly have that conversation tonight. We thought it was a good idea to have, you know, a little bit of extra on there because folks ask, you know, because they fall in love with the design, and it's not exactly 800 square feet, it's a little bit more. So we just kind of thought we wanted to give people a little bit more opportunities there, but you know, we're not married to it, so we can certainly have the discussion if you'd like.
Yeah, and I don't know if I have strong feelings either way. I was just kind of, you know, and just seeing that kind of variance opportunity, I think many people then start to think, oh, well, it's actually 1,000 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's what they then start to design off of and anchor off of and those kinds of things. So right. I think that's where I was just wanting to kind of better understand that. I'd be curious if any other commissioners have any questions or thoughts kind of on that. I have a handful of other ADU things, but if anyone else has anything on this 25% increase, I'd be curious to hear.
I like the idea of the flexibility, you know, and it doesn't mean that it's a rubber stamp. You know, if it's not right to put 1,000 square foot ADU on a particular site, or with a particular, you know, design or siting of the structure, then, you know, there's an opportunity to either, you know, look for ways to mitigate for it or to deny it, you know, under this process. And it just doesn't require the time and expense of going through the planning commission or public hearings before the planning commission. So I think that this is a good way of adding some flexibility for something that, you know, should be pretty straightforward. And I don't know that we should look at it like a rubber stamp, like it's just automatically 1,000 square feet is what you can do. That's just how I feel. That's my thoughts about it. Anyone else? Vera?
So I just wanted to add that, you know, an up to, you know, a 1,000 square foot ADU, it still is part of the overall lot coverage calculation as well. So it would be, I'm not going to say unlikely, but there's extra review happening if it's a smaller lot and a bigger ADU on it, because it's triggering other things as well, setbacks, lot coverage, all of those sorts of things too. So, you know, I could conceive of a site that has a pretty big house on it and is on a big lot, and they want an ADU, and so it's proportionally probably works for the lot, but it's bigger sort of on paper. It's 1,000 square feet, but you know, if it's an oversized lot or something like that, it might be very appropriate for that site. So it's giving people a little of extra room, but just, and to echo Commissioner Edge, yeah, we don't rubber stamp any of these things. We're definitely looking at all of it, but it would still be reviewed along with all of the other design and development standards. And lot coverage is one where I would think that those extra 200 square feet might actually make a big difference on a lot. So it would need to be for the right site, I guess. Yeah.
Did you have other comments you wanted to share? Oh, Commissioner Massey, go for it.
Thank you, Vice Chair Edge. I particularly appreciated your question about how often has this happened in the recent past, because I think the context really informs people's views and on a subject like this, because they kind of see these in the abstract, that they say. I think your question was, well, how many times in the recent past does something like this happen? So I would just urge the staff to just use that in any future presentations, because I think that context lends a lot to the discussion, because sometimes it can be like, oh, this is going to be some widespread change. And in fact, history tells us it's not.
Thanks for that comment. Commissioner Sherman, did you have other ADU related questions?
I think the only other question that I had, one first part is kind of a comment, and this is on page 83 of the packet, in D on the approval standards and criteria. It says, or text reads, an application for an accessory dwelling unit is allowed outright provided if the following standards are met. And I just wanted to make sure that we're talking about each of the following standards being met, which I'm assuming is what the code means. So we might want just a clarifier there.
Mm-hmm.
And then sub B, which says 1 accessory dwelling unit per lot is allowed. I really was interested in talking about this with the commission, because I could envision many scenarios where someone might want to do an internal to the house conversion, convert your basement into an ADU, and still have ample room in their backyard, and also be able to put an ADU, accessory dwelling unit there. But the code here is not going to necessarily allow that. And so I wanted to just talk about that and hear kind of from staff, both your thinking as well as kind of the commission's thinking on that specific topic.
Well, from a staff perspective, we actually didn't, this was one particular item. We were thinking about it as, it did come up sort of in the, is it 1 ADU per lot? What if we have a duplex? Should we allow each duplex unit to have an ADU? And then we started to get more and more, we kept talking about it more and more. And so we settled on keeping it the way it is, knowing that these questions were going to come up during the discussion, and it should have been a key question. So I'm glad you caught that, Commissioner Sherman. Thank you. I'd be curious. I would be very interested in knowing what the Planning Commission thought, particularly that scenario, Commissioner Sherman, that you just described. We could allow 2 ADUs per lot, if one of them, or per house, there's a couple different ways we could talk about this. But, provided that one is an attached ADU, and then one is a detached, there are multiple ways we could approach that. I think that's certainly one way of doing it. I know Portland is allowing double ADUs, so they're allowing 2s, kind of like a little duplex ADU, I guess is what it is actually. In the new code that just dropped this week, I guess, right on August 1st became effective. So I did notice that as well. So kind of right in time for having this conversation. So yeah, what, if I may, through the chair, what are the thoughts about how many ADUs should we allow?
Commissioner Hemer has his hand raised, so I'd like to give him a chance to speak.
Yeah.
You're muted, Greg.
I lowered my hand and I forgot to hit the other button. It's only been 16 months. You think I'd have it. So the definition of cottage cluster is 5 units, right? Or 5 buildings.
Well, it's at least 5 I mean, it's defined around a green and so on. It can be more than 5. Yeah.
Okay, so what happens is, right, is that an ADU, right, is probably less expensive for permit fees and the whole 9 yards than a cottage cluster development. So if you just allow ADUs outright, somebody would say, oh, well, I have enough space to build 4 ADUs when they should really be building a cottage cluster type situation. And I think that's why this 1 probably exists, right? And maybe this 2 might be okay. But since we're allowing cottage clusters, now all of a sudden, right? I mean, our 5 ADUs, because they have the space, isn't that necessarily, almost a cottage cluster anyways, and should be probably treated a little bit differently than just, 5 ADUs. So that's what I would just like to say. And so I think that if somebody wants to go for a type 3 or a type 2 variance to add another ADU, I think that would be fine on their property to add as many, but you should make it at least a little difficult so that people just aren't doing ADUs instead of the right thing and doing cottage clusters.
Any other comments from the commission? So I would personally endorse a very aggressive ADU strategy, and maybe not ADUs for cottage clusters necessarily, but because I think the way cottage clusters are defined, makes it kind of challenging to be able to provide an ADU. So anyway, I think that would be really difficult to work with the code to make that but I think that with the other middle housing types, that as long as there is a really strong definition, correlation or relationship defined between the primary dwelling and its ADU or ADUs, then I think it's okay for a duplex or a triplex or even a quadplex to have ADUs that are all, 75% the size of the primary dwelling, and they have they're either attached or have some relationship to, proximal relationship to the primary dwelling. So anyway, I think that we could get, I think that we could be flexible with the code, kind of free with the code that way, as long as we have a strong relationship defined there. And then the other thing is I would really like to see the ability to do 2 ADUs on a lot per primary dwelling. And maybe you say not 2 ADUs on, middle housing, per primary dwelling on a middle housing. I don't know. I mean, it starts to get, how does that even work geometrically? But certainly on a single dwelling, developed lot, I think that having, 2 ADUs, even if they're both detached, is probably okay. And, again, they have to meet all the other standards and the lot coverage standards and the size standards and, dimensional standards and everything. So I think it's probably okay. I would like to see it allowed to have 2, at least for single detached dwelling. I saw Commissioner Khosrowshahi, I saw your hand go up first.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. I actually see the pros behind that. I'm just trying to figure out what would be the cons behind it, aside from what Commissioner Hemer brought up with that you had addressed just now. And other than that being a concern, what else? I'm just trying to think what else would be the reason not to do that. I mean, can we think of any why we wouldn't want to do that? I mean, as you stated, with the lot coverage and the other requirements they'd have to meet, I don't think it would be, unreasonable. It's not like they're going to try to fit, 10 spots on a 5,000 square foot lot, I guess, because we would have obviously restrictions to that. But is there any other cons that anyone else can think of why we wouldn't want to do that?
Yeah.
I won't say it's a con, but I will just point out, I think to Vice Chair Edge's comment about, having an ADU with middle housing types, except for cottage clusters, I like the notion of having them, have a relationship with the primary dwelling. I'm trying to figure out what those clear and objective standards look like, to kind of connect an ADU with its primary dwelling. So it's a challenge. I think I'm just trying to figure out how we would write that. That's all. I'm just going to kind of pin that over here. I just wanted to remind folks that we are not allowed to require parking for ADUs. So it's just something to remember that if you did have a site that had a triplex, under our current, as proposed right now, we're going to get to parking in a second, 1 space per dwelling. But if you also have 3 ADUs, so there will be 6 dwellings on the property, but there would only be 3 parking spaces required. So I'm not suggesting that that's a pro or a con, just something to remember that those are off-street parking spaces that we can't require. And depending on the location or what, it's just something to think about, that on-street parking would be necessary. If folks had vehicles, they might not, of course. But it's just something to think about from a kind of a neighborhood perspective or on the street, that those additional units won't have parking spaces to go with them unless someone builds them, but they won't be required. So just pointing that out.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of is the, if I can just say really quickly, Commissioner Sherman, before I let you jump in, that is kind of the thing, is whether or not, you're allowing parking to be built. And so, what you don't want to do is say, is have a situation where a quadplex is appropriate and you end up with a duplex with 2 ADUs. So anyway, and I think it's important to not think about it strictly in those terms, because again, the ADU needs to be a fraction of the size of the primary dwelling. And so it's not like we're creating 2 equivalent structures that will house, an entire family. Each one will house an entire family. It's still an ADU with the constraints and benefits of an ADU, in terms of, how many people could actually live in it. So anyway, Commissioner Sherman?
Yeah, thanks, Vice Chair Edge. I think maybe just to kind of round things out, I also would like to see 2 ADUs kind of allowed outright, especially in a single dwelling kind of context. I think that makes a lot of sense. And maybe things get too complicated as we're thinking about duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes. Maybe not. But I definitely think that in that single dwelling context, 2 ADUs, whether they both be detached or one is attached and the other's detached, I think makes, to Commissioner Khosrowshahi's point, like it's hard to envision what the downside is really there. So I'd really like to encourage some of those changes.
Commissioner Hema.
Yeah, you know what? I could go for the single family unit. I have a really hard time with the quadplexes, the triplexes, and the quadplexes. And the only reason is because you're allowing for a certain amount of density. And now all of a sudden you can double that density on that same lot if you have enough space. It almost makes it seem like, well, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you might be able to get an 8plex out onto that site, which is supposed to be for the R1 and R1B zones, not for residential. So I think what happens is that when you start adding in the duplexes, the quadplexes, and the triplexes in with an ADU, that you become that it actually becomes out of character of the neighborhood and should be put in a different zone, to be honest with you. That's my personal feeling.
I would be interested if staff would be willing to maybe come up with some draft language around like defining that relationship between the primary and accessory structures, so that we could then just consider how that language might work in a middle housing context for future discussion. Commissioner Khosrowshahi.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Commissioner Hemer for his comment, because that's probably the downside is having the triplex and then trying to add 2 more ADUs. And I can see that as being potentially an issue. Maybe a good place to start would be limiting it to single family for now, potentially, and see how that language turns out first, and then see if it's possible, if it's something we even want to dive into for, triplexes or duplexes. But I see why you want to limit that. So I just wanted to point that out. I appreciated that comment.
Anything else on ADUs before we move on? All right, take it away, Vera.
Okay, let's go. Let's go to parking. We've talked about this before, but just wanted to kind of close the discussion here on this. We've added a couple of things. So again, for the proposed code amendments for parking, 1 space per unit would be required. The parking space, the change that the parking space can be in the driveway or in that setback. Right now, as we know, the parking space has to be outside of the setback. So this way we're sort of freeing up some extra space on the site, freeing up some garages for stuff. You don't have to park in them. So we've talked before at other work sessions about alternatives to parking location or numbers. What if somebody wants to build fewer or something like that? We do have our existing parking modification process that can allow folks to get creative with their parking on the site or with the number. But one thing that we've added that we wanted to have folks have us talk about, we've been thinking about internally, what are some ways that we might be able to incentivize income restricted housing within the code? We can't require income restricted housing, but what are some ways that we might be able to give them a leg up or make things a little bit easier to try to build some income restricted housing? And income restricted housing is how we're referring to it, as opposed to affordable housing. We want to make it really clear that we mean really income restricted housing, not just less expensive housing, I guess. So what we're thinking about is, could we incentivize income restricted housing through the parking requirements? And what we're proposing, and this was in the staff report, is this idea, I hope it was in the staff report. Yes, that for any a multi-unit dwelling unit, so an apartment development or a middle housing dwelling unit that's affordable, and there's a specific definition for households at or below 80% of the AMI, that the minimum parking requirement could be reduced by 25%. So sort of a by right reduction in off-street parking for each income restricted unit that's part of a development. It's not a huge reduction, of course, but it's assigned to each unit itself, so that you can get some incremental reductions in the number of spaces that someone would have to provide on the site. So that sort of concludes the parking discussion. We've talked about this a little bit before at previous work sessions, but this idea of the incentive for the income restricted housing was the one that I wanted to think about. And it should be, and just so you should know, in case you're not aware, the way our code talks about what your minimum parking is, if it's a fraction, you round down. So if it's a fraction of a whole number, it's always rounded down. So our code wants us to have fewer parking spaces when you do the math. So 25% might not sound like a lot, but in the aggregate, if you get to round down, it could potentially, take away 1 or 2 parking spaces on the site, depending on how many units you're building. But again, it would be for each income restricted unit, not overall for the whole development. So let me stop sharing and see what you think about the proposal.
Commissioner Humor.
Yeah. So, and I sent this concern to Vera, and I want to make sure that it gets captured. That we understand that the driveway of a flag lot, right, cannot be used as the parking for the dwelling in front. That the front unit, or even in a back lot, I guess back lot is probably should have similar rules that that there is a required parking spot for that front unit so that somebody is not blocking somebody's driveway by right because we say, oh, well, you don't need that parking spot.
Yes, thank you for that reminder.
Commissioner Cultrabati?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really like the incentive for the affordable housing, because that, I mean, anytime we can incentivize, especially with that, I mean, you know, we incentivize it for other developments. I don't think we incentivize enough for affordable housing, to be honest. But I think that would be that's a good place to start, because I know that that does reduce the cost for the developer, the contractor. So yeah, I like that. Anything that can drive more development towards, you know, affordable housing is I'm all for it.
Commissioner Sherman?
Thanks, Vice Chair Edge. To Commissioner Cosrabati's point, I think we could go further. I think we could be thinking about a parking requirement reduction of 50%. Because I don't know if 25% is actually going to send the market signal and get the outcome that we're kind of hoping for. Just as I was reading through, and we could talk about it in a moment, as reading through the code, and we have these provisions on car sharing. I mean, how often is that actually taken advantage of? And so I'd like to, with something like this, I think we could go out a little bit further. And if it becomes problematic, we can make the change in the future. But if we also don't go far enough, we just don't know if and how the market is necessarily going to respond to that. And I don't think something like this would be opening the floodgates and suddenly having our streets congested with cars.
Commissioner Massey?
Yeah, I would just like to echo Commissioner Sherman's comments, is that, especially in the example that was given, it took, went from 10 spaces to 9 spaces, and I'm just not sure that that's a needle mover. And so I don't know what the answer is. I don't know whether it's 25%, 50% or whatever, but I going from 10 to 9, just in that context, and I know it was just one example, it just didn't look like a big deal.
Commissioner Hemer?
So my affordable housing friends, I'm gonna ask some questions that I really actually I think would help us maybe with this. So in here we call it low income, which is 80% under the median household income, right? Is what we're calling it. Which is it seems like a really high number to me. And so what my question is that when do you qualify for a subsidy program? What is that range? It can't be 80%.
It is. So 80% or below of area median income is considered that qualifies for subsidies. 80% is the number. I mean, it's different categories. So there's 80%, you can do 60%, below 50%, 30%. I mean, so there's different ranges of affordability, but 80% is sort of the kind of the at or below is sort of kind of the high. That's the top end of affordable housing, I guess.
Okay.
80% is the floor for what's considered workforce housing, which is 80 to 120%.
And just for context, just for context, in the 2021 calendar year, area median income in the Portland metropolitan area for a family of 4 at 80% is $60,000 a year for the total household income.
And so there are levels to these subsidies, or what you can get as a match, or if you can get into these housing units, right? Is that the way that I kind of understand it? So why don't we tie this thing into that 80, 60, 40 with these parking reductions that we say, hey, you know what, if you're going to do an 80 building, right, then you can do 25%. If you're going to do a 60 percentile, then maybe get 33%. And if you're going to do a 40, then you can do because it seems to me that even at 80% household income, they're not going to be getting rid of their vehicles. We know that the vehicles are the last things that people hold on to in these situations. And so they may be looking at their bills and trying to get out of their situation and say, well, I can't afford a vehicle, but they may also have one that's, $1,000 that they've had for years and it still runs. So I would much rather see it tied into the tiers if we're going to give a larger deduction than I would just an outright bigger deduction.
Yes, I want to jump in here really quick because I'm watching this conversation happen and not participating in it yet. This is exactly what I wanted to say, is what Commissioner Hemer said. I want to see the amount of the reduction indexed to the AMI, the percentage of AMI that the income restricted units will be provided to. And I think it's important to, basically have some data, behind that. And I think, really what Commissioner Hemer is saying is a really good point, is that depending on where you fall in comparison to AMI will lend itself to the likelihood that you still have a vehicle or not. And so we know that, vehicle ownership rates for AMIs of 20% or whatever is, down in like the 30%, 30 something percent or, and so we can, I think that we should actually, look at the data and say, okay, well, we know that, people in at this income level, only 50% of them own cars. And so we should only require 0.5, spaces per dwelling. If you're providing them to that income level, and that should adjust depending on what income level you're promising through some kind of enforceable long-term instrument that you're providing them at to those income restrictions. Greg.
And I think what we have is a really good test case that we can actually figure these, look at it, right? The Providence thing, which is that Providence building that may or may not get built, but that we passed it, right? So here's a building that is made for probably that lower echelon of that income. And of course their age probably has a lot to do it, but we know that they don't have enough parking on site to satisfy the number of dwellings that they have, right? Even though they say they're going to use the lot next door. I get it all, but so this is a good test example, maybe that we can run those numbers, right? Because we have a living example, and maybe come back and see what that kind of looks like, so that we can kind of compare it a little bit.
If I could, I'm going to add to that. We can also take a look at what the Hillside development is asking for. That's affordable as well. And I know that they had some calculations. I remember the spreadsheets. I can't remember them, but I remember that there are spreadsheets. So I'm going to go back and take a look at those and see if they have tagged them by income level to a proportion of vehicles. I bet they could probably just tell me that too if I asked them. So, but that we can ask, we have resources to find out. And I like the idea of indexing the reduction that way. Yeah.
Commissioner Sherman.
Thank you. I think the only other thing that I would kind of maybe add, and I like the indexing a lot, Greg, I appreciate you kind of bringing that up, is, and maybe to the idea of kind of going further, is also even thinking about kind of location of some of the facilities located near frequent transit. Maybe we should also, be thinking about, maybe taking things to, maybe not all the way to zero, but maybe close to zero. Again, depending on where we're at in terms of income levels and proximity to transit. So I think that would just be another kind of interesting thing to think about, especially in this context of for income restricted housing, not just regular, market rate housing, but for this income restricted housing. I think pulling those levers hard, I think, is the kind of response that we need.
If I could,
Sure.
just to that point, Commissioner Sherman, so the code already has, and they're not tied to specifically to income restricted housing, but we do have some automatic reductions when you're with proximate to public transit, both for multi-unit dwellings and for parking for all uses except for single family attached and detached dwellings. So depending on your walking distance and so on, and maybe what we need to do is kind of look at, are you allowed to sort of add them all up to all of these percentages? Maybe you do get to add them all up if it's income restricted housing, and that might get us down to those numbers. So I think there's a way that we can think about, because I know for downtown, you can't, 30% is the maximum amount of reductions you're allowed to take, even if you qualify for a bunch more. But maybe there's a way to think about to aggregate the different reductions. If it's an income restricted unit, dwelling that happens to be, income restricted, you get the index reduction. You're also within a 500-foot, walking distance of a bus line, you start to add these things up, and now you're, you can even squeak that down even more. So we'll take another look at that and check that out.
Anything else on parking while we're here?
Oh, can I just add one thing? It's not in the code
Yeah.
that you received because we're still tweaking it, but we are looking at adding information for EV ready hookups for new development, including multi-unit developments, even though that's not exactly what we're talking about, but we're trying to embed EV ready requirements for new construction as well. So it's not perfect yet. We haven't quite got it dialed in, but I've sort of drafted it and added it into a couple of sections. So when you see sort of the hearing draft, we'll have the EV ready stuff, unless I have it sooner, and then I'll bring it to you and let you see kind of where we're going with it. But I didn't want to let that fall off your radars. That EV ready language will be included in the code as well.
Commissioner Hemer.
Yeah, I was going to bring up my point again about parking, that, extension cords across the sidewalk is a bad policy. And so, I'm not quite sure how, if the plugins have to be housed indoor. What I hate to have it do is become an accessory structure, right? Instead of part of the dwelling or whatever, and to house an electrical unit or whatever you need to do. So I just want to make sure that we don't create a bunch of conflict, but they somehow can get put in there.
Good point.
And Commissioner Sherman.
Thanks, Vice Chair Hedge. Just on the topic of housing, a few other things that I kind of was looking at as I was just kind of going through the code on page 74 of the packet, parking modifications, approval criteria, B2, I'm just trying to pull it up, talking about kind of an adverse impact. This feels really vague, and I would propose we strike that language. So that was, I think, one. Another kind of parking related thing was on page 76 around car sharing. And I think to kind of the Commissioner Massey's point earlier, and kind of the question that I begged, like, has this actually been utilized? If not, what are the changes that we might want to consider in order to have that tool actually be something in kind of our toolbox? So that's, I think, another piece. Page 78 of the packet, parking service or parking surface materials. There's I'm just trying to scroll to it really fast. there's a suggestion of the city encourages pervious paving systems. Why don't we just require that? So those are some of the things. And then just because I probably couldn't not have this conversation and not say this, but I think in terms of page 72, it's table 19.605.1, which is what lays out kind of all the parking minimum requirements. I really think that for single dwelling, we should not be requiring a minimum spot. A developer might still want to build that as an amenity, as something that the market might want and that people might be willing to pay for. But from a city policy perspective, as we're thinking about our cost of housing goals, and we're thinking about our tree canopy preservation goals, and we're thinking about this really robust parking analysis study the city did that says we have ample supply in the public right of way. I don't think we should be requiring it. If it becomes a problem, we can fix that in the future, but I think we should make that change now on the single family, not necessarily on the other kind of multi-dwelling side of things. I would propose that as well. So those are some of my my parking thoughts that I wanted to make sure to share.
Sorry, just on that point, Commissioner Sherman, we can't not require parking for single unit homes and require them for middle housing. They have to be the same. So yeah, so if we're going zero, we're going zero for everybody. So I'm not saying we don't go zero. I'm just saying we can't do it for just the single unit home. Point well taken for sure, but we have to be consistent across the uses.
I'd be curious to know what the collection of comprehensive plan policies that support having a minimum of one space per dwelling unit versus not having one. You know, what's the balance of comp plan policies that support the 1 versus 0 argument? And is that a discussion worth exploring further, based on city policy, adopted city policy? I was looking at this when Commissioner Sherman was talking about it. There's under on page 74 under approval criteria C2. I thought you brought up B, right, which is it will not adversely affect available off-street parking. Well, even C is maybe could use some revision around or otherwise complies with city policy. Something along those lines, because the smallest reduction needed is a very strong word there. And it may be that it's the requested reduction is, the most consistent number, in the with city policy, comp plan, policies, but maybe is not the smallest needed, and it still is appropriate. So that's just giving us some flexibility there, I think is useful.
That's a good improvement. Thank you. Good suggestion. Shall we go to comp plan and zoning?
Sure.
This is where it's going to get a little interesting. Okay. All right. So part of this project is also, of course, amending the zoning map and the comprehensive plan map and text. So the proposal for the comprehensive plan land use map is to consolidate our residential zones. We have 4 residential land use designations in the comp plan, and we're proposing to consolidate those down to 2 so that our low density and our moderate density comp plan land use, our land use designations would be consolidated to moderate density, and that we would consolidate our medium density and high density to high density. And that will correspond to the zones, which we're going to get to in a second. But that's our proposal for the comprehensive plan land use map, is to go from 4 to 2. And then the text itself would also be edited or revised. Again, the moderate density residential MD, the zone that would go within our zoning map is, it's not R2 anymore. Proposing that it be RMD. And those were the R5, R7, and R10 zones. So since we're consolidating those, that would be our moderate density residential land use designation in our comprehensive plan map. And then we made a few tweaks to the language within the text, not substantial. It was just to make it consistent for the zones that it, or for the land uses designations that it goes with. And then the high density residential, and we're going to get to this, and this was in the staff report, so we'll get to this, but the high density residential would be all of our high density residential zones. So we're kind of gluing those all together, but those would be in our high density residential land use designation in the comprehensive plan map and text. And so okay, so now we're going to go to the zoning map, and this is sort of, that's why I left it to the end, because it's a bit different than what we proposed before. So I'm just going to go right to it. So our original proposal for the zoning map was to consolidate our 8 residential zones down to 3. So we would have our high density, our RHD zone, which was R1, R2, R2.5, and R3. We would maintain the R1B because there's an inconsistency across the land use tables when it comes to office uses. And then the RMD is our moderate density zone, which is the R5, R7, and R10. Okay. So as we looked even further into all of this and we got really into the weeds on the code, we realized, and we should have realized it sooner, I'll be the first to admit that, that there's an issue with the consolidation of our high density zones, and the R1B and the office uses is not the only thing that's the problem. So we've seen this table before. This is our RMD zone. So we have our lot sizes, the permitted housing types that go with them, and how that works with our current zoning code. And we talked about this at one of our previous work sessions when we talked about consolidating our current low density zones, and we're calling them the moderate density zones because of all the additional housing types that we can permit in them. The tricky thing comes when we're talking about our higher density zones, because as you can see on this chart, R1B through R3, there are multiple conflicts across these uses or these zones. So I've highlighted a few of them here. Multifamily or multi-unit is one that they're all problematic because, you know, we've got a variety of either they're allowed or they're not, or they're allowed by right, or they're a conditional use. There's no simple way to just make them all permitted by right or all conditional use. Either way, this is an entirely new concept that we would be bringing if we were trying to, in fact, consolidate all of these together. The R1B was always going to be kind of on its own because of the office use business, but the other ones, we have multiple things that don't align across the zones. And so what staff is proposing for now is to keep these zones as they are right now, but insert the middle housing types into them. And so we would just kind of keep the existing table, but we would insert the various middle housing types that we need to allow into them and table the consolidation until we work on the hubs project, which is starting in the new year. And we would take on the high density zones and this consolidation and the reconciliation of these uses within that project. So that's our proposal, because part of our concern would be, we certainly don't want to make multifamily a conditional use in zones where it's currently allowed by right. That's going backwards in what we're trying to achieve as far as housing opportunity throughout the city. But we don't think it's appropriate to now make multifamily allowed by right in zones where it's currently by conditional use without going through at least some sort of a community engagement process to let folks know that that's happening. There aren't a ton of properties that this affects, but there are there are some. Many of them are already built out with multifamily, but not all of them. In particular, in Ardenwald, there are a couple of R3 areas that don't really have the multifamily housing, and to now allow it by right without having a conversation about that, and just making sure that we don't have any unintended consequences of just simply, oh, find and replace. We'll just make it permitted and we'll go from there. We really wanted to make sure that we did it right. And we don't want this to distract from the rest of the code either. There's already a lot of change happening in the code. And so we would propose to maintain these zones for now where as they are, and not consolidate them, and then take this up during the hubs project. So here's part of kind of what that, as an example, we would take this table as it is right now, but we would be inserting triplex and quadplex, into them to make sure that we account for the middle housing types across the zones as they are right now. There's definitely work that needs to be done here. If I could jump back to the permitted uses, the multifamily isn't the only issue. We've had, even at the staff level, trying to figure out what the code means when it talks about a congregate housing facility versus senior and retirement housing versus a nursing home, which is as a community service use, which isn't even in this part. But, and this all came about when we were talking about the Rusk Road proposal, which was Brett's proposal, that wasn't mine. But having those sorts of, that was just a great example of, well, what are all these things? Are they really different enough? I mean, we kind of want to delve into these definitions a bit and really make sure that we know what we mean when we're saying these things, and should some of them be allowed by right or by conditional use, are they really that different? There's just some more to be done there to kind of clean this piece up. So that's staff's pitch for that piece, so that at the end of the day we're only going down to 6 zones from 8, but it's moving in the right direction. We have fewer, and the bulk of the city, of the residential zone, certainly would be this RMD. I mean, it's covering, I think I had the numbers in the staff report, kind of just on an acre basis, how many more acres or how much more of an area in the city this actually covers. So it's a lot more, I think. Yeah, it's over 2,000 acres compared to less than 400 acres in the high density zones. And so we think the consolidation really does matter for sure in the RMD zone. So it's an achievement to be able to get that done. And then we can start dealing with the high density zones during the hubs project as sort of a subsidiary of that project, and that we would address it at that point. So that's our proposal for the consolidation / not as much of a consolidation as part of this project. So I'll stop sharing and answer any questions.
So how many of our R1 properties are currently developed with single detached dwellings? Do we know that?
How many are R1? Okay, hold on. While we're talking, I'm gonna bring up our zoning map or our second. Okay, I'm gonna zoom over really quick because I know we've got. Are there more questions? Keep talking. I'm gonna look up our one right now while we're doing that.
Oh, well then the follow-up, depending on how easy that is,
Yeah.
the follow-up would be then R2.
Mhm.
And then what I'm wondering is, it looks like R2.5 could maybe be consolidated into R2 without
Yeah.
much consequence.
Mhm.
But I'm first off, I'm curious about how we're using the R1 zone lands now.
Yeah.
And are there other opportunities for lower density zoned lands to be rezoned as R1? Or is that kind of an impractical thing based on existing development patterns?
So we have we have 3 areas of R1, and all of them are multifamily development. They're all developed and they all have multifamily development on them. So that's the R1 and the R2. let's see. So the
Considerably
R2 is,
more R2, but I know a
yeah,
lot is multifamily, right?
a lot of it is, but a lot of it's not, because it's R2 is a lot of the area around the downtown and around the high school. So
Yep.
there are a lot of single unit homes in the R2 zone, actually. So yeah, R2 is a large amount. So it basically goes from Harrison Street, through Washington Street, and then down towards the high school. So that entire area of the downtown is all R2. So there are some multifamily development, but there's a lot of single unit homes as well. And then there are a couple of pockets of R2, really small, that seem to be covering other, let's see, multifamily on Harmony Road, for example. And that's it.
Oh, right.
So, and then R2, of course,
Okay.
is in the Waverly, but that's all the Waverly apartments development is all R2 as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So it strikes me that R1 doesn't really seem appropriate for detached single units or even middle housing. But maybe that's really a true multifamily district.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the intent of R1, is to really be multifamily.
Yep.
And so I don't want to, not to make it more difficult to build, middle housing, but I think that that's a fair consideration, is whether that's the most efficient use of that, of the land with that zoning designation. And if we're looking at other sites that might want to rezone as R1 at some point in the future, do we want them rezoning as R1 to get access to middle housing, or do we want them to rezone to R1 to get access to more intense multifamily housing or mixed use even?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's my comment about R1. I again feel like R2.5 could be rolled into R2 pretty easily, but there's a big enough difference, I think, between R1 and R2 that we keep those separate, or kind of, R2 gets the middle housing, but maybe R1 doesn't and is purely multifamily. But otherwise, I appreciate the challenge that you were going through with the permitted use table there, and trying to figure out how you could do this. I think you did the best that you really could, given the situation. And I agree, we don't need this to be about, we don't need other distractions here. The focus of this is really, accommodating middle housing, in our residential districts. And so I think that's the important thing, and you're finding a way to do that. And we'll have other opportunities, I think, to consolidate zones in future implementation phases of the comp plan. So I feel comfortable with this, even though it's not anywhere. It's, the 8 to 6 doesn't feel like what we were asking for, but I think you did what you could, and so thanks for that.
Yeah. It's a disappointment, I'll say. But,
Commissioner Hemer.
What is a congregate housing?
oh my God, it's a great question.
I mean, I read it and I
Mm.
have a dirty mind. So all of a sudden I was like, that doesn't make a lot of sense if the city's going to permit that outright. So what does it mean?
Yeah, so I think, so to me, it seems that the congregate housing and can be something similar to assisted living, nursing home, that sort of thing, where it's folks that need medical staff or additional assistance. They qualify for housing under federal fair housing amendments, and it's generally common housekeeping facilities. The problem with our definition is that it talks about permanent housing with individual or common housekeeping facilities provided to people who need a more supportive living environment. So it could be something along the lines of an assisted living, also senior living, and maybe it's a combination. That's why the Rusk Road project was pretty difficult to figure out, because different parts of it were different things, so you had sort of like the true assisted living, but you sort of aged in place kind of thing. You might have just moved to a different part of the facility if you needed more assistance, depending on how your health might have deteriorated. And that was sort of the idea, but we don't have one definition for that kind of a situation. the way our code is set up, it's kind of for each sort of pod of things. And we've gone around and round in our little hallway right here about, well, what is the difference? What does it mean? And we've looked at it, and I think if we looked at it every day, we'd have a different answer. It's really, our code is really complicated and confusing, I think, the way it's written. And I think, and that I would really like to clean that part of it up, because I think it's really difficult. I can't even tell you right here, if you ask me, what is it? Well, I think it's sort of an assisted living kind of thing, but it might also be independent living as well. It's
Right.
a lot of different things, I think.
Which I think is why we're going to look at it in this next
Yeah.
phase. We're going to go in there and figure it out once and for all and clean it up. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's better
It looks like
definitions
the
out
definition-
there, you know, so.
Yeah, I think the definition for it could include, intentional co-housing, and maybe, you have people who are able-bodied and younger who want to live in a place where they have their own independent private space, but also shared services like a shared kitchen or, other shared facilities, that kind of, so I mean, that you can share with your neighbors basically. And so it's, that could be congregate housing as well.
That's a
Commissioner
good
Sherman?
point. Yep.
Thank you. I was just in this might have been what Commissioner Edge was kind of mentioning earlier about the R1, but I was just looking at the table on page 30 of our packet, and that's table 19.302.2, high density residential uses allowed, and was noting that multi-unit is a conditional use in the R1 zone. And should that just be permitted outright? I guess I was just kind of, if this is where we have a lot of our multi-unit, why, or go ahead, please.
No, sorry. So that was part of the code, the section that you have that was printed was when we thought we were consolidating all of the high density zones, and we were calling it R1 and we shouldn't have. So
Perfect.
just kind of pretend you haven't seen it, because it's going to come back to you new. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yes.
I'll just
Yeah.
plug my ears. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Commissioner Massey.
Thank you. Back to this subject of congregate housing, I think that we're a little bit too focused on senior living facilities, which are typically described as, independent living, assisted living, nursing care. I think that this is actually beyond those sort of descriptors, and that it could be a situation where there's some level of common living arrangement with shared services, and that could be things like the Northwest Housing alternatives, or halfway houses, or temporary houseless shelters, and that kind of thing. So I think that descriptor needs to be a little bit more holistic than just focused on seniors.
Agreed.
Agree. Commissioner Hemer.
Now, I will say that my favorite zoning map that I saw was Mr. Bondi's zoning map. And if I were king, that would be how I drew it too. On your main arteries, put all your density, and off your main arteries, don't. And that's really, if I was king, that would be the way that I would do it. But I appreciate the attempt to try to make this easy, and that it turned out to be hard. So I just want to say this comment, and this is all in general. So I attended 2 NDA meetings, the Linwood, which I do, and I attended the Ardenwald to hear what they have a generally proactive land use group. So, and I wanted to do Island Station, but they canceled their meeting for some reason, and I don't know if you ever got in front of them or not. And at any rate, and they're another proactive land use group. So I wanted to hear what they had to say about this, and I got to hear Vera's presentation twice, which was excellent. Of course, I heard 2 different presentations, because it was just R1 and R2, I think, at the Linwood, and then it went to R1, R1B, and R2 at the that. But I was surprised at how little reaction there was from the NDAs. about this because I expected Ardenwald to especially be a little bit more sensitive about the density issue, I guess, but they weren't. And then of course I went on Engage Milwaukee, which I'm sure all of you have, and read the comments. And certainly, Laura, will you give a big pat on the back to Mary? She was very nice in answering everybody's questions and doing everything that was right that she could do to help either calm the noise that was going to be generated off of these comments or answering the questions correctly, right, or the way that they should be answered. And so and what happens is that, you know, as cities grow, the people that have lived here for a long time have a resistance to change. The housing situation and the houseless situation has not seemed to get any better, and probably has even grown a bigger divide. And if I may say that there's more people that are on, you know, the side of just get them out of town than there are, hey, let's try to help them. You guys aren't down there by 92nd and Division, 92nd and Powell. You know, it is horrific, the conditions that are out there. And not only for the people that, you know, choose to live in the tents, but for the people that have to occupy that space along with them. And so, and I was surprised that we did not get more comments. We didn't receive any comments from any NDAs. The only comment that we got was from Mr. Bondi and from what was Engage Milwaukee. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of worried a little bit about the outreach, right? That I understand that, you know, it's summertime, we got to get this done. I am concerned. You had 22 responses on housing. You know, that's a hot button issue that you would think that you would hear more about. You have the Kellogg Bowl thing that's kind of shutting down, which then brings back this nostalgia of what Milwaukee was like. And, you know, these little things trigger these little memories. And so I guess I'm trying to encourage whatever we can do to reach out to the public a little bit more. Hey, look, if they don't care, they don't care. But I think a lot of them do. So when I talk to my friends and my neighbors, you know, they don't want a bunch of ADUs around because in their mind, it's going to bring in what they call riffraff, which is, it's a lousy way to think of it. And yeah, I tell them, hey, it's not the way that thing really works. I said, also, don't worry. I said, you know, it's $1 million to $1.5 million project to build 6 or 7 ADUs or a cottage cluster, you know, in this land area. There's a lot that has to happen to make that all work. And so one of the things that I would, and I know this is outside our purview, but reduce the amount of CETs on ADUs and on cottage clusters and triplexes and duplexes and that to accomplish your goal, right? Stick true to a plan that we carry forward. So, right, we have this comprehensive plan. Commissioner Edge or Vice Chair Edge brought this up earlier, right? How much does our comprehensive plan say that this is a good idea, and how much of it chooses not to say it's a good idea, right? I don't think that there's really either or, but I would like to take one more, just kind of ask staff just to take that one more little dive to make sure that, hey, with what we come up with our ideas, is that really what the comprehensive plan says? And is that really what the residents of Milwaukee want? And there are opportunities. So August 29th, there's a farmer's market. I don't know if you guys are allowed to have a booth, but August 29th is the downtown big deal. September 19th is the Milwaukee Parks Foundation is doing a deal down at Waterfront Park or Milwaukee Bay Park or whatever we call it now. And that October 8th, there's the Homecoming First Friday that is going to be downtown. And so that brings a different variety of people maybe. And I don't know if you guys have time or the wherewithal or if you have to get invited, but to have community booths out there and say, hey, let's, check some boxes, or, put up your little things and have people put stickers, or I don't know if we're beyond that stage or not, but just my suggestion.
If I could, I just wanted to point out, I was at the farmer's market 2 weeks ago, and gave out postcards and answered questions for folks. So there wasn't a ton of people that came over and talked to us, but we were there. But you've mentioned some other, community events where we can have information, and we've got postcards that we've already printed out and stuff. So we have the information available that can take people to Engage Milwaukee, and they can get all kinds of details, or they can talk to staff. So we'll take a look at the community calendar and see what other events there are that we can have, at the very least, materials there, or have staff there too. So we'll take a look at it. It's a great suggestion. Thank you. Yeah.
Commissioner Sherman?
Thanks. Just following up on Commissioner Humer's kind of questions there, or comments kind of around some of that outreach. I just wanted to clarify, having gone through a comp plan update when I lived in the city of Portland. I mean, if a property is being rezoned, there's a legal requirement to send notification to all of those property owners. Is that correct? I mean, will most everybody who's getting rezoned from R whatever they are to RMD be getting a postcard saying, here's where, this is happening, here's the process, here's the opportunity to weigh in, those types of things?
Yeah. Noticing is required. So we'll double check with city attorney kind of what kind of notice is required when we're doing a citywide thing like this. But yeah, we will follow all of the noticing requirements. So yeah. Yep. Okay. Let's see. Are there other questions?
Can I just follow up on something what kind of questions are you getting at the farmer's market?
Well, a couple of questions were, what are you doing? And so we answered them. So we explained all the things. I had a couple of very lengthy conversations with folks with one woman who's lived here for quite some time, who's well versed in affordable housing and was very interested in what we were doing, and then wanted to know what kind of money we were also helping to subsidize development so that we could get more affordable development. So we had a long conversation about stuff. So she was very happy to hear all of the things, and was glad to see that we were doing this. And then I spoke with a collection of middle school teachers who had just moved here to the Portland area from Iowa, and wanted to move to Milwaukee because they came to the farmer's market. And so they wanted to know all of the things. So we also explained all of that stuff too. So those were a couple that stuck out in my mind that had quite a few conversations with, but we gave, we had flyers and just postcards that had, all kinds of information, and I answered as many questions as I could for folks that wanted to know what was happening. So yeah, but we did get a lot of questions. Yeah.
It might be helpful too, Vera, as we're moving forward we have a public and an engagement kind of overview of all of the outreach that we've done throughout the entire project. So it hasn't just been at the Engage Milwaukee at this stage. This is our third time at Engage Milwaukee. We've gotten a lot of feedback. We've met with all of the NDAs. We've met with other interest groups. So it might be helpful just to kind of share all of that with the commission next time, so that everybody knows exactly what's been done. So we've been trying to engage folks throughout the whole process.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't mean to make it sound like, oh, you guys haven't been out. That's not the case, right? I guess my worry is that, right, you can only do so much, and you guys have gone above and beyond, right, the outreach process. I totally get it. It's also been, 16 months of us all being shut inside of our houses too. And so what I'm afraid of is that it's going to get down to the end, and the pitchforks and the torches are going to come rolling down because people didn't feel like that they get a chance to engage. And so I'm just trying to hedge that from making sure that our residents understand and feel comfortable with what's happening.
And to that point, and Laura, to your point about having kind of that overview, it might be beneficial for our next series of meetings, you know, the rest of these work sessions, and as we move into more of that formal process, to like have a canned part of the presentation that's right at the presentation of here's the outreach that we've kind of done that's got us to where we are here on the map today. And you know, some of us might get tired hearing that for the next several meetings, but I think leading out of the gate with here's all the outreach that's been done, pilot articles, this and that, I think could be a valuable thing for people who, you know, to Commissioner Humer's point, there are going to be some people who show up for the first time and say, I never heard about this. And so being able to kind of lay out that path that we've been on, I think would be really valuable.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. And we're also going to continue to run articles in the pilot. The next pilot article is going to be in October. Is that right, Vera? It's October or
There's
September?
a September one, and it's
September.
going to be tree code because the timing isn't right for what all of our stuff is happening. It's too far in advance of the hearings, but the October one will be just in time for the hearings. Hopefully, you know, when those start as well. So yeah, we've had an article in the pilot, every pilot since last September as well. So yeah.
I like that idea though, Commissioner Sherman, of just kind of remembering to tell that story and tell all, you know, all of the work that's gone into the outreach, I think will be helpful. And there's going to be some people that are still going to show up at the very end and have something to say about it. And that's just kind of sometimes the way, not sometimes, but pretty much always the way the process works.
Commissioner Massey, I see you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure.
Okay.
Anything else for Vera? Commissioner Sherman?
I just had a few other kind of random things as I was reading through, just doing my leisure reading of our city code. And I was curious in terms of, I think it's page 18 of the packet, table 19.301.4, townhouses and cottages. I think there's a minimum yard size of, I think it's 15. And I was just really curious, like whether and how we think that helps advance or not some of our tree canopy goals. And I was curious if there'd been any conversations with tree board about like, is that enough space where you'd be able to put that tree to help us kind of get there? So that I think was a question or a comment.
May I follow up on? So the 1,500 square feet is the House Bill 2001 requirement for townhomes. So that for each individual townhouse. So that's the requirement. For the cottages, so a cottage still needs to be part of a cottage cluster. But the idea of the 1,500 square feet was that if in a cottage cluster, they wanted to divide the cottages onto their own lots, but still be part of a cottage cluster, then 1,500 square feet was going to be the minimum lot size for each individual cottage. But it's still part of an overall cottage cluster, still needs to meet the minimum, you know, tree canopy and landscaping and all of that stuff as the cluster itself. But it was trying to just anticipate a potential future subdivision of a cottage cluster, and to create that minimum lot size for that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I think the only other kind of a handful of other comments was page 36. There's a reference to height exceptions. I think this is under single dwelling residential, and the ability to get an additional story. And I was just kind of like, oh, how do you get that additional story? And then the language kind of right after that read something about, made it sound like you could get plural additional stories, and we might want to just kind of again clarify if it's only one, maybe the subsequent language should read for each additional story or for the additional story. Just kind of add that level of clarity there.
Do you mind, sorry, Commissioner Sherman, do you mind giving me the section number, not just the page number? Because my code that I've been working on isn't the same as yours. It's not the packet code. So is that possible? Sorry.
Yes. So this was in
19302. Oh, I just had it. 19302.5.
Okay.
And it's E.
Yeah.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And then I think the only other kind of a comment was on page 67 of the packet. It's the purpose statement around townhomes. And I think as I was just reading through, I think the purpose statement around townhomes is very different from the purpose statement for cottage clusters. And I know we're talking about different things, but I was just thinking that we might want to consider taking some of the language from that townhomes purpose statement and inserting it also over into cottage clusters. The first sentence was one of the things that kind of came to mind there. So that was kind of an additional comment. And then I think two questions that I kind of had was page 63, this is around cottage clusters and the cottage standards. There's this orientation in, I think it's 3, orientation 2B, and it talks about them being within 10 feet of a common courtyard and around this minimum of 50% of the units around that courtyard. And I was kind of like, why 10 feet? Why 10 feet from the courtyard? Why this like 50% around the courtyard? And so just kind of wanted to hear any of your thinking about that.
Yeah, I can. When the consultant was helping us put together the cottage cluster standards, she was looking at other cottage cluster code, but also looking at the model code that came out of House Bill 2001 as well as a way of doing that. But I'm going to put a pin in this for a minute because on the 24th, we're going to be talking about all of the design and development standards for townhomes, cottage clusters in specifically, and we may have some additional tweaks to that. So if it's okay, I've noted your question, and so we'll make sure that we have good answers for why we're doing things. And the consultants are working on some graphic illustrations of a lot of these things as well. So hopefully that will help answer the questions. But it sounds like what you're asking, why 50%, why 10, why not something else? So I think those are fair questions, and I'll make sure that we've got answers to be able to explain that.
Okay.
Yep.
And then maybe I think it is my final thing. So thank you for the airtime, fellow commissioners. Is on page 55, it's the 1 to 4 unit design standards. I think as I was reading through that and reading through the ADUs, I know I'm going to miss the meeting next week, and maybe I'll send you an email with some of my thoughts on flag lots and back lots. But we have a lot of these standards talking about this orientation towards the street in order to help develop that community, that stronger community feeling and connection and those kinds of things. And I just want to make sure we don't lose that as we're thinking about other structures behind other structures. So I'll probably send some of that via email, but it was just really salient as I was kind of looking through the package. And maybe we as a community, we decide none of that stuff matters and we should just gut it from here. But I think those are the things, we should be thinking about how we're applying those kind of evenly across, these different uses.
Yep. Good.
Anything else for Vera? All right.
Okay, I just have one other thing really quick. I just wanted to remind folks sort of where we are in this process. So we're here, we're in our work sessions. We are accepting and collecting written public comments. We're tracking them in a master spreadsheet starting now. We're starting through these work sessions. And then as we move into September, depending on how these work sessions go and sort of where we are, the goal was that in September we're posting all of the noticing and so on, and doing all of our outreach to get ready for public hearings starting in October. Generally is the idea, and we'll see kind of how we go as we move forward with these work sessions and with the hearings. And then totally for myself, Canada's playing the gold medal match tomorrow morning, so I just wanted to put this. It's also how we're going to feel when the code's adopted. So it does double duty, and that game was supposed to be tonight and now it's tomorrow morning. So I'm actually really happy that I didn't miss it. So that's all. That's all for me.
So I have
Thank
one
you for-
question. I have one question. The when in the process is the right time to really revisit the lot sizes and which middle housing types are permitted on each on the lot size ranges? Because I know that we've talked about that before. Commissioner Hemer and I have been, kind of largely advocating, for a certain approach, and the rest of the commission,
Mhm.
I feel hasn't really weighed in very strongly, and so I'm just wondering when are we going to talk about that and give others the chance to really voice whether they have a strong opinion about that or whether it's really just Commissioner Hemer and me cheerleading for that. Which is fine, I will accept whatever reality is, but I think that's a discussion that I don't want to let go until we, have a strong recommendation from the commission that we're all pretty comfortable with,
and I
or
think
similarly
that's-
uncomfortable with.
I think that is an appropriate conversation to have on the August 24th session when we're talking about the design and the development standards, because lot sizes will go with all. There's going to be a lot to talk about that night because design development standards is a big topic, but lot sizes go with that. I don't know that it makes sense to talk about lot sizes if we're not already also talking about lot coverage and setbacks and all of those kinds of things. So I think that's the appropriate time to have that. If you have specific things to send or comments in advance, that's great, but we can go back to the other work session and remember what you talked about, but that would be when the time to bring that up. Yeah.
So I would echo what I said earlier, which is I'd be really interested to know what comp plan policies support the approach that's proposed versus an alternative approach, such as what Commissioner Hemer and I have been advocating for. I'd like to know what our adopted policies really are telling us to do. On balance, of course, I realize that there are competing policies.
Got it.
And just a reminder, Chair Ed, or Vice Chair Edge and I has a laissez-faire attitude that we don't understand why the lots has to be, why you have to restrict it to a certain amount of lot coverage, right, or lot size. So that everybody understands what we're talking about.
Oh yeah, I didn't elaborate on that at all. Thanks for that.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, that concludes the presentation and the discussion for batch number 1. I really appreciate the comments. I can kind of go back, I think, and sort of draftly finalize a lot of this code language, and I may need to come back for some additional refinement if I have some other questions, but you've given me terrific direction. So I really, really appreciate it. It's great.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad we could be helpful, and thank you
Yes.
for your time as well. Okay, so moving on. Other business or updates? Do commissioners or staff have any other business or updates?
One thing I just wanted to say is that I think you all had met Janine, our planner. She was our most recent planner that we added to the team. She's also going to be switching teams, and she's going to work. She's sitting in the same cube, but she's going to work for community development. So she's going to be the housing and economic development program manager. So that's a really exciting thing for her. We were sorry to see her leave us, but we're glad that she's still with us in the building. Is it actually going to be working on things with us? So we're going out to get a new person in that position. So I just thought I would let everybody know.
Well, congratulations to Janine. Any other updates from the commissioners?
I'm not going to do an ad for the museum this time because I did it last time. I'm sure you guys all wrote it down. You've been checking our Facebook to find out what time those events are. And I tell you what, 5-year-old kids that love to throw crap down sinks will probably really enjoy the show on the 14th, just to let you know. But the carefree days are coming these Sundays. And so take the opportunity to look at the calendar. I know that the 8th is at Wichita, which is, I'm pointing because it's just kitty corner from my house. And then downtown is the 29th, and I'm not really sure where the other one is in the middle. And I apologize for not knowing that off the top of my head, but it is all on the city calendar. And encourage your friends to get on that comp plan page. It's right at the title next to call for sculptors. So if you know any sculptors, but encourage them to get on there, sign up for that Engage Milwaukee, and get them all happy about it. So there you go. There are my announcements.
Thank you, Commissioner Hemer. Commissioner Massey.
If you didn't already know, let me just remind you that the used book sales that the Friends of the Letting Library puts on have returned to Sundays. They're not actually in the market. They're on the market days between 9 and 3. And they're north of the library in that open area up above the amphitheater. And we've got sandwich boards out there around the market directing people to that sale. And so those used book sales support the outreach activities of the library. We underwrite a lot of those. And so I urge you to come out. We have a well-curated selection of books for you to peruse at exceptional prices. So I look forward to seeing you there on Sundays. And although I will certainly be happy, like Vera says, when the code is adopted, I'm really not all that excited about Canada winning the soccer gold medal. Sorry.
Commissioner Sherman.
Thanks. I was just curious, maybe to hear from staff as well as for anybody who's tuning in to maybe get any updates that there might be about the very exciting news with the city receiving funding from the federal government through the American Jobs Recovery Plan, or whatever ARPA the acronym is, thanks to some of the advocacy and support of Senator Taylor and Representative Powers. Are there any updates on kind of the development of some of our parks and what those timelines are going to look like?
I do not know those things off the top of my head, but I can bring you a little update next time. No problem. I will talk to Kelly Brooks. I know she's been leading a lot of those efforts and has been super involved, so I can bring you some of that info.
This is a follow-up question, and it's going to be for Vera because this is a Denny thing. Did we ever ban the master plan? Did we ever pass that thing where they didn't have to come back with a master plan every time they wanted to do something a little small?
The parks master plans are not in the comprehensive. Wait, what did we? They're outside of the comprehensive plan.
Okay, so we don't have to go through a whole big old ordeal, right? When they want to change something or do something?
Yeah, what we don't have to go through is a comp plan amendment process. I mean, there's still a process to revisit the master plan, but it's not the full-blown type 5, comp plan amendment process.
Good,
There's still a
good.
public process, but it's not the same thing. Yeah, Denny did, man. Yeah, we got that.
Good,
We got that.
Good.
Yeah.
Anything else?
One more, just because as I've moseyed around town, I've been curious. Central Milwaukee Bikeway. Where does that work that we were doing stand? I know that I kind of left our plates and went off to council, and just be curious. And if we need an update next time, I'd be happy for that. But I'm just a little bit curious on where that stands.
I can tell you that right now it went to council, and council did not come to kind of a conclusion on which was the preferred route. So that is going to get discussed further during the update to the transportation system plan, which we should be cooking off early next year.
Did council, they wanted a tunnel? That was a joke.
All right, anything else? All right, cool. Any other items for discussion? then let's review our forecast for future meetings.
All right, great. So as Vera has said several times, we've got August 10th and the 24th, our continued work sessions to talk about the comp plan implementation. Then on September 14th, we're going to switch gears, and it's a variance for the Bonaventure Senior Living walkways to look at the pervious pavement variance. And then also, just so you know, it's not on here, but September 28th, tentatively right now is looking like Coho Point is going to be before you all. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to talk about. So I'm looking forward to that. That's been a long time in the making for the city. I've been working on that for a long time. And just as an FYI, I won't be at the Planning Commission on the 24th or the 14th, but my fearless colleagues will be running the show those evenings. So, well, actually Vera won't be there for one of them either, I think, but right. But we'll get it all worked out. So, oh, and one other thing is I did get a chance to look at the calendar, and I do believe that Thursday, October 21st could potentially be the date of the joint meeting with the Planning Commission and the NDAs. So that is what I'm going to shoot for. I'm going to contact all those folks and see if that works for everybody, and we'll try to get that scheduled.
And Laura, just to let you know, the NDA leaders and everybody, they're all getting together to go over the rules of being an NDA leader.
Oh,
So, and I think that's happening really quick. Hopefully it hasn't happened yet, but maybe shoot a quick email over to Jason
got it.
and maybe if you could get a minute to chat at him or however that all works.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll do that. That's all I've got.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Someone's got to do it.
I will make a motion in Lauren's name because it is almost only 8:30, and if she was here, I'd milk it out for another half hour, but I won't. So I'll make a motion in Lauren's name.
I have a motion to adjourn from Commissioner Hemer. Do I hear a
I
second?
second the motion.
That was a tie. I'll give it to Commissioner Cosrabati this time. So I guess we're adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Oh, wait, no, we have to vote on it, right? Sorry, vote. Do I see hands? All right, all in favor. Very good. Unanimous pass. We're done. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.